Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, theater, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And I just wanted to mention really quickly, if you're listening to this episode as soon as it comes out or the weekend of, anywhere between October 2nd and October 5th, you can nab an absolutely free ebook copy of my novel, The Black Palace. It's a Welcome to October promotion running on Amazon. Check out either the link in the description of this episode, or just go to Amazon.com, look up Josh Woods or The Black Palace, either or, get you there. All you got to do, click on it, get your free ebook, and just getting that copy of the ebook will help me out. And you might even enjoy it if you check it out and read it. It's yours permanently if you click on buy this ebook for $0. And that's running for a short while. Check that out. So today's episode, I get to talk about fairies and demons with two really cool professors, scholars, poets. We're getting into the perilous realm where fairies and demons cross paths. And we're talking about fairies and demons as they exist in traditional folklore, in the works of C.S. Lewis, in the creative writing process, even in real personal experience with a story about a real exorcism. Believe it or not, I think you're going to like this episode. So I get to speak with Amy Trogan, who's an Inklings scholar. She's professor of English at Florida Southwestern State College, that's in Fort Myers, Florida, and she stays quite busy there. Among her many roles, she's involved in crafting effective assessment policy for the 21st century. She gets into research about the links between two-year colleges and the high school dual enrollment programs. But where I pick her brain today is the research she's done with the ties between faith and literature from the 19th century to the present, and especially her research with the Inklings. She's had some rare opportunities to dig into some research with some primary source material with the family members of the Inklings themselves. And she offers us some really cool insights into what she sees happening through the works of C.S. Lewis, especially as they relate to the demonic and even the fairy. Brandi George, also an assistant professor of English there at Florida Southwestern State College in Fort Myers, Florida. She's the author of Gog, that's 2015, Black Lawrence Press. That won her the gold medal in the Florida Book Awards. And Play in Verse Fawn by Play in Verse 2019. Her poems have recently appeared in Fence, Gulf Coast, Columbia Poetry Review, winning first place in the Dana Awards and the Zone 3 Poetry Awards. She's had all sorts of residencies and other accolades, and she has really cool insights on where the world of the fairy and the demon cross paths in her own creative writing and the creative writing process in her personal life. Between the two, or between the three of us, I guess, because I jump in there too, I think we explore some really cool territory and make sense of this seemingly wild notion that we're going to try to make fairies and demons exist in the same podcast. I learned a lot from this episode, talking with these two awesome scholars and authors, and I think you're going to enjoy it too. So here we go. Well, first of all, Amy and Brandi, thank you so much for joining me on The Monster Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to be here.
I got the pleasure of meeting you through a friend of ours, a recent podcast guest, Joe Van Galen. Um, he was mentioning, hey, I've got a couple people I work with down here at Florida Southwestern that I think you might enjoy talking with. And it was very quick into our chatting over Zoom that I found out, oh yeah, we've got some really cool things to talk about, because turns out both of you have some experience, some knowledge, some even personal interest in fairies, in the world of fairies and demons. And then the writers such as Lewis and the Inklings, who were very interested and played with both, as well as working with that in your own fiction. And I realized, man, we have not done a fairies episode despite the requests I've had so far. We haven't really done much with demons. Let's mix the two. And I think we'll have to defend mixing the two to a lot of listeners right now who are thinking, how dare you put fairies and demons together or in one episode? But maybe after talking or after hearing both of you, we'll begin to see a little bit why that is. So first, maybe we could start, Amy, and then Brandi. Maybe tell us a little bit about your background and the kind of works that you've focused on.
Again, I'm Amy Trogan. I focused on humanities with a concentration in 19th century British literature. For my doctoral work, I did move over to the College of Education. I have an EDD with where I focused on curriculum and instruction. But I actually became interested in C.S. Lewis at an early age. And for a lot of people, I know it's the Chronicles of Narnia that is usually their first exposure to Lewis. And I do love those works, but for me, it was the Screwtape Letters. I always have thought literary groups were just absolutely fascinating. And so Lewis became even more interesting because of the Inklings, and I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about them. I've always kind of been discouraged. There really are no women who joined that group, but I was, and I think we all understand this, but I was down a rabbit hole, just kind of researching and reading some things about the Inklings, and I came across one of the Inklings, Owen Barfield, his wife Maud, and just a few comments on the literary estate webpage for Owen Barfield, and she seemed so fascinating, and so I decided I wanted to do some research on her since. Actually, it was the comment where it said that the one who curates the website, which I found out happened to be the Barfield grandson, but he considered Maud a mentor to Lewis. So I reached out to the trustee of the literary estate, and as I said, it's the grandson. And he actually directed me towards some research in the States. So then I applied for a grant, and I was able to visit the archives at, it was Azusa Pacific University, had a lot of great personal items that the grandson donated to that institution, but also there was so much great information at UNC Chapel Hill, and I also went to Wheaton College. And that's where I did some research, found out more about, I found out more about Maud Barfield, but also her relationship to Lewis and really the dynamics between all three, Lewis and both Barfields.
Very cool. So and thank you. And Brandi, how about some of your background and your works?
Yeah, sure. So Amy, first of all, that sounds so fascinating. A lot of my interest in demons and fairies is, I think I handle more as a writer than a scholar. So my interest in these kind of supernatural creatures stems from my own personal experience. So I've had these sort of like visions since I was a child. And when I was an adolescent, I had an actual exorcism. So my parents were very religious. They had a strong belief in these sort of demons and angels. So when I started writing, my work included monsters and other supernatural creatures. And when they asked me how I had written these things, and Josh, I'm sure you'll know this as a fiction writer, I said I didn't know where the characters had come from, and that it was sort of like being inhabited or possessed by these different beings or characters. So my parents sort of thought, this doesn't sound right, right? Why would my child be inhabited by a character? They didn't have a lot of experience with writing or creative processes in general. So they sort of mistook these experiences for demonic possession. So this actual exorcism sparked my interest in things like biblical literature, books about demons and angels. I read a lot of Anne Rice when I was younger, and I was trying to figure out the nature of good and evil and how my desire to write fit into that. So at a certain point, I think I tried to stop writing altogether. But the sort of interesting thing is that the process of writing itself was the only way to get the characters out of my head. And what I found was that this creative process was sort of like the real exorcist. It was the way to find a balance between reality and the visions, and between the sort of things in my imagination and the things that were in the physical world.
God, this is now. I hope as listeners you might start to see where the fairies and demons cross over, because I get to talk with an Inklings expert and with somebody who has been possessed by fairies and demons enough to merit an exorcism, actually. And Brandi, yeah, I absolutely have. I think a lot of writers have felt, or at least writers should feel at some point kind of possessed by these characters that seem to come from beyond them. But that's also the kind of thing that Lewis and Barfield and Tolkien seemed to apply. Well, most of the most important years of their lives were figuring out, like, what is the nature of truth, and how do we get at it. And I think we got to see from C.S. Lewis kind of the most drastic shift out of all the inklings of how one gets at truth. And it very much involves this sense of fairyland and fairy and demon and this other reality. And so I definitely want to come back to that, but I would be remiss if I don't ask you, Brandi, could you tell us more about this actual exorcism? I haven't actually witnessed one. I definitely haven't been a part of one that I know of. What did it involve, for those of us who might have the incorrect image in our mind of the Exorcist film, right, with the head spinnings and stuff? I can only imagine it was not like that. So what was this like, if you don't mind talking about that?
I don't know. I don't at all. I would hate to disappoint everyone. This will be very disappointing. My head did not spin around 360 degrees. It stayed very much intact. My exorcist is a really fascinating character, actually. She was a sort of evangelical minister, and before that, she was a medium. So she converted to Christianity after being a medium and became this exorcist, and she performed exorcisms all through Michigan. And she would usually perform them on young women who were probably between the ages of maybe 10 and 16 or 17 would be the ages that we were dealing with. And a lot of these young women were writing certain types of pieces of, they're writing poetry, or they were into witchcraft, or they were doing these various things that she would the parents would call her, and she would come in and give them these exorcisms. So it was really common, is another thing that people don't realize. And it's so common, in fact, that another person in my creative writing program had one. So, I mean, we think of them as these exotic things, but they're really happening all over the country at an alarming rate, perhaps. So this exorcism, this woman, she was really interesting. She kind of looked at my writings. We had this like interview to check whether or not I was possessed. she looked at my writings and determined that yes, in fact, I was. I wish I would have asked her what made her know that, but she didn't check them, and she was like, "Yep, for sure, this one's possessed." And so we kind of went through. She kind of put holy water on everything and oil, and did these sort of like, in the name of Jesus Christ, I kind of revoke thee or something like that about 100 times. And the funny thing was, at the end, she was like, I didn't succeed. I didn't actually get it. And I want to come back. And my parents were sort of so freaked out at that point. They were just like, let's just forget it. So it was unsuccessful, thankfully, in the end, because I think writing still is a sort of possession. And interestingly enough, I think that it's necessary for the process.
That is fascinating, and I can't help but think I would also fail the test or pass it. I don't know which one it would be. And then by looking at my writings, going, "Oh yes, this person is messed up, and demons are at least part of the problem." I think so. Wow, that that seems to me to kind of to mirror the history of fairies into demons, at least a little bit in England. I mean, I know, at least in Europe, what we count as fairies, I guess, gets a little vaguer the farther you get away from the strictly Western tradition. But at least in Europe, we had the classical Greek and Romans had all sorts of fairy-like creatures, and they seem to be mixed up with all sorts of nature spirits and many gods. And the German and the Celtic had a really strong fairy tradition as well. But then, over time, especially in the age of discovery, that started kind of dying out even among folk traditions, except in England, it was holding on pretty strong. And then there seemed to be something about noticing this kind of magical, mysterious, essentially neutral force and seeing it as demonic, as one might see like something like a creative impulse in you and start seeing it as demonic. And so perhaps we could get a little bit, Brandi, your impression of fairies and the fairy tradition as you know it and you've explored it. And then maybe Amy, we can get into a little bit about what the Inklings saw as fairy-like and magic, and especially Lewis, and then how he saw what essentially makes the demonic. So that's a whole lot to throw at you. So maybe Brandi, we could start with fairies, and then we'll go Amy into Lewis's approach to it.
Yeah, sounds great. So my interest in fairies, I mean, at a certain point, demons were working really well for me in my writing, but then they sort of started to feel like maybe a little too binary for what I wanted to do. And I transitioned to fairies because they're so complex and the sense of good and evil in them is mixed together. And so I found them to be really interesting. And I was really surprised when I started researching them, because in many parts of the world still, places like, in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, fairies are accepted as a part of reality. There are many fairy faiths and fairy traditions in which people just, I mean, yeah, there's trees and rabbits and fairies, and it's perfectly normal, and everyone knows someone who's seen one, or maybe they've seen one themselves. So it's really interesting that what we see as something totally imaginary in the United States, a lot of people don't see it that way. And so as I started to learn more about them, I realized, there's a lot of sort of explanations in these parts of the world for their existence. There are theories that the fairies represent pre-Christian religions or pre-Christian deities. But more and more, as I researched, I found that fairies were connected with the dead. So fairy mounds are places where fairies live, were often these sort of ancient burial sites or earthworks. So fairy sightings often included those who had recently passed away. One of my favorite types of fairies is the changeling, for instance. changelings are basically fairies that are exchanged with a human child. So the changeling or the fairy will then sort of wither away and die while the real child lives on in the fairy realm. So it's like a way, I think, for people to handle death, maybe in some sense, of where the child goes off to live somewhere else, and the fairy is the changeling is the thing that dies in reality. Also like mothers who are breastfeeding will also be victims of fairy abductions. There are a lot of legends that like fairy children need human milk to survive. Fairies also steal cow's milk and butter. So it's like a real fascination with fairies and milk, which is really interesting. There are also a lot of types of fae that go beyond the sort of human-like representations of fairies that we see in popular culture. One of my favorite books is William Butler Yeats' book, Irish Fairy and Folktales. And that book includes a collection of personal accounts. He went and interviewed people for this book, Irish people that had seen fairies or knew fairy legends. And he talks about a diverse range of fae, including things like leprechauns, pukas, you think of like Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream, banshees, brownies, even witches, ghosts, and fairy doctors. There are also these kind of seers who are able to see fairies typically. So it's just a really interesting tradition that's very, very complex. And these beings are almost never these sort of cute representations of like little cute beautiful women that are 10 inches tall with skirts made out of flower petals and butterfly wings. They're terrifying, like powerful, mysterious creatures.
Yeah, and you bring up several points that I should correct myself on, and I'm sure there are listeners right now screaming at the speaker at me for screwing this up. One, yeah, I very much should have said British Isles, like someone in Scotland or even in Northern Ireland to hear me say England was probably furious at me right now. So, and then. Yeah, because you're right, that's very much alive there and has a strong tradition in it. And at least modern occultists, although the tradition has been for a while, at least the modern occultists and pagans all seem to agree that properly the word fairy refers to fairyland or this other realm that might be layered on top of ours or might be a dreamlike realm, but it has some physical substance. And then those various creatures that you've named that inhabit that, the elves themselves, or leprechauns, or even banshee-like spirits, those would be fae, and so, but now in America, we seem to have a kind of, like you say, a Tinkerbell image in mind, and we call them simply fairies. So I'm okay with messing that distinction up, but you were right to make that. And I hadn't thought about that nice version of the changeling. The changeling has always ever been terrifying to me. This image of this of a young mother watching her 3-month-old suddenly stand up in the crib and then say wicked things to her. Like, oh my God, but no, you're talking about a much more generous and kind of, I don't know, a really sympathetic, if not empathetic way to handle the death of a child. I hadn't thought about how deep that runs. That's beautiful.
Yeah, and fairies in general, I think they have been sort of cast in a sort of evil or wicked light, but that's not at all how they always appear in the legends. I think they do have a function that's really is beautiful within the culture of creating this other realm, this sort of realm of imagination, even that infuses reality with meaning and allows us to sort of communicate still with those who have passed and with that which is gone, or maybe that which has been forgotten. And the names for the dead and the names for the traditions are gone, but the sense of the fairy is still there somewhere that you can still access it.
Yeah, and this, this sense that, fairies were something bigger and grander than the Tinkerbell image. That was very much important to the Inklings, like Tolkien, like Lewis, like others, and in fact for Tolkien, I think perhaps one of the ways that to do justice to this image of the fey creatures is to imagine the elves from Middle Earth and how tall and grand they are. What Galadriel was 7 feet 2 inches tall or something like that. So I mean, there's these tall, grand, powerful, ancient things, and that's how Tolkien saw them. And he took great issue with Walt Disney. Well, what he hated Walt Disney in general. He took a lot of issue with that kind of Walt Disney image of them, and I think the other Inklings took these things seriously as well and didn't see them as incompatible with Christianity, which was a strange route. And I keep bringing up Tolkien as kind of like a bridge over to Lewis because until he had his many hours of arguments with Tolkien, C.S. Lewis was he not an ardent, nearly militant atheist? Very much. I mean, we kind of know him now as a kind of Christian fantasy writer, but he was not until he got converted by several, but primarily Tolkien, as I understand it. And he wanted to bring in these fae and these fairies as well, but he saw this distinction. Something was different with the demonic, and he seemed to have some brilliant ideas about it. So maybe Amy, if you could tell us a little bit about C.S. Lewis and how he maybe played with these other realms in and getting into his Christianity and then seeing what is at the heart of the demonic.
Sure, you're right. I mean, you guys have had such interesting things to say, and it does relate to both Tolkien and Lewis. They studied myth, but particularly Celtic tradition. One of the writers who's considered really the first fantasy writer, a lot of people consider, George MacDonald. And he influenced both writers, and it all ties together because MacDonald was influenced by Celtic myth as well. And you're right. As far as Lewis was a militant. I think militant's a fair word, atheist, and certainly there were many conversations he had with his fellow Inklings. You've mentioned some, but he also, Barfield, who I mentioned earlier, was also influential. They had years of debate, a lot of it documented through letters. They called it the Great War. And one of the things that they discussed, well, it really focused primarily on Barfield's adherent. Barfield also was a Christian, by the way. He was also a Christian. But when you talk about kind of combining myth with their Christian beliefs, one of the things Barfield did is he was an adherent to a philosophy called anthroposophy. Lewis, and Barfield's wife really rejected the ideas of anthroposophy, but the Great War between Lewis and Barfield focused on anthroposophy, and of course you have Barfield supporting it and Lewis. But this all and Lewis, of course, rejects it. And all of this happens prior to Lewis becoming a Christian. This debate kind of ends once Lewis becomes a theist, actually. But the anthroposophy, one of the reasons why this kind of fits into all of this is because Barfield indeed believed in notions outside of our reality. And Barfield believed that that our imagination, for example, could get us closer to truth. And that was one of the things that Lewis was not about that at the time of the Great War between them. He felt that imagination is like this enjoyable enterprise, but then it didn't lead to truth. And so that was kind of the focus of the Great War. But he never, while the Great War ends, Lewis never accepts this philosophy, but he begins to believe that there's truth to be found outside of our sensory experience. And that he crosses over to the spiritual realm on a personal level at that point. And then he kind of camps out there, on a literary level. I had mentioned the first book that I read of Lewis was the Screwtape Letters. And this is a book about, they're letters between two demons, an experienced demon, Screwtape, advising his inexperienced demon nephew, Wormwood, by the way. And he's telling him, he's trying to give him tips on how to tempt and attain the soul of a human. Now, the humans are known as patients, by the way, to the demons, which I just found kind of interesting. They're patients. We were talking earlier about your early podcast episodes where you kind of overview literature and the monsters and literature and different literary periods. And I was listening, and it was while I was rereading Screwtape Letters, by the way. I haven't picked it up in a long time, till fairly recently. My recent research didn't require it. So, but all of a sudden you started talking about medieval and Renaissance literature, which again, Lewis was chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. And when you talked about Dante, you were talking about how gluttony, I think you called it, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't you call it like a gateway sin?
Yeah, I think in those early episodes, Monsters in Literature, I forget which part it was, but when we get into that stage of Monsters in Literature, one of the monsters that stood out most to me out of Dante's Inferno was Carabas, or the dog gatekeeper of the underworld, in Dante's version of him. And in Dante, he's essentially the lord demon over the plane of gluttony. And I thought that's so fascinating that he wants the gatekeeper to be gluttony, as if gluttony is a gatekeeping sin. And once you start thinking about that, it starts to make sense. But Lewis was there long before I was, right?
Because this interesting thing where Screwtape tells Wormwood, hey, don't underestimate the power of gluttony. And one of the things, this is a little off topic, but one of the reasons why Screwtape says people don't understand gluttony. It's not just about excess. And then he says, I think that's kind of a reason he gives for people, why, let me put it this way. You don't want to underestimate gluttony as a way to someone's soul, because it's actually quite powerful, but we don't really understand it. He says it's not just about excess. Lewis kind of goes into this redefinition of gluttony almost. He morphs it, if you will. And he's like, it's not just about excess. Some are just, when you see these people who are kind of obsessed with the best of everything, having, finding just the best place to enjoy the perfect dinner or having the perfect home or car. He says that's a form of gluttony. And he says it's still very powerful, But if we don't understand what gluttony is, you're not going to use that as a tactic to get your quote unquote patient. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I really got excited when you mentioned gluttony on your podcast. And of course, there's other works, in The Great Divorce by Lewis, which it's been a while since I read, but I remember that his concepts of heaven and hell are also influenced by Dante. And there, in The Great Divorce, there's also a guide, but instead of Virgil, it's George MacDonald, who I already mentioned, and then Milton too. I remember you talking about Milton in your early episodes. I see a correlation to how the demonic world is presented. Milton portrays Satan as persuasive, intelligent, charismatic. Lewis portrays the persuasive power and intelligence of demons through Screw Tape, this particular character. They basically destroy through manipulation. That's how they get to people. When we think of monsters, so many monsters, we think of them as like this physical threat to our bodies. And, the cool thing kind of about demons is they don't really pose a physical threat. They pose a threat to your soul. Anything that happens to your body is really just collateral damage in a way. And of course you have with Lewis, the portrayal of that supernatural world through the Chronicles of Narnia, and also the Space Trilogy, which was a fairly early work of his as well. So they were he was very steeped in this tradition.
Yeah, and all those works, one of them that kind of brings a couple together that you're pointing out of Lewis is a really short work, if I'm remembering correctly. Screw Tape proposes a toast in which he talks to like educators and he's talking, it's like he's talking to other demons about how much progress they've made in the field of modern education. And then if you just take out a couple of key words like the enemy, or like or his various euphemisms for their Lord Satan, if you just change that with like I don't know, Higher Learning Commission or something like that, that speech could totally be given today. It's like something like, we've got to make sure that no one gets their feelings hurt for being lazy or stupid students. And so we have to just hold back the good ones and fake the bad ones and then make everybody equal. And if we trick everybody into thinking this is democracy, then we're going to bring down civilization and bring everyone to hell. Like, oh my God, this is exactly this is all understood to be the right kind of way to go about it now. Little do we know, I think we're following Screw Tape the Demon's educational plan for America. I don't know, but
absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was probably one of the things that the last reading is where I kind of caught on to that, just made some of the same correlations you are. I think the first time I read it, I was just so intrigued by, also growing up in a Christian tradition. I found Lewis both orthodox and heretical at the same time. So often throughout that work in particular, just because you have Screw Tape saying things such as, oh yeah, if your patient's going to church, we can use that. No, this is good. Don't worry about that. This is all stuff we can use. He's going to meet a bunch of hypocrites when he's there. And I was just like, wow, somebody's saying that? We're not supposed to say that.
Yeah, he was not afraid to say that. And you're right, there was something key to his understanding of this temptation over and to the demonic or down into hell about gluttony. But so many of our notions of it, I think at least mine, have to do with just an excess of food. But you're right, there's something else. Like Lewis, if I'm recalling correctly, and maybe in Mere Christianity, was saying something that the heart of all sin is this effort chase down, to like recreate some sort of great pleasure that has passed already. So to take something, rather than to let something flow naturally, to like force it like a hack to recreate that experience. And then almost all sin, it comes out of that well. And that's kind of his notion of gluttony, I think. And he had so many other brilliant concepts that are just so useful today. Just Bulverism, which has no, I guess I'm way off track here, but ever so briefly, since I mentioned it, like the great logical fallacy he solved the modern era, he decided to call Bulverism, which is a terrible sounding word, but makes so much sense. Like the logical fallacy of explaining why someone would be the kind of person who would be wrong about it, by exposing what could be their motivations, but never actually saying that they're wrong or how they're wrong, just why they would be. And then if all you have to do is watch the news or watch Twitter, and it's just nothing but Bulverism all throughout there. And so he was ahead of his time in seeing all sorts of strange and bad and demonic things in us. But you're also right. He started seeing that there's some other truth you can get to through this creative impulse. And that's another one, Tolkien lays out very carefully in On Fairy stories as well, that there's this other land to get to, and it doesn't have to be the demonic one, that you can get to through this connection to something other, through creative writing. And it reminds me kind of, Brandi, of what you were saying about feeling like these other things were inhabiting you, and needing to pull the poetry out of you, needing to pull this creative writing out of you. And it sounds like you don't make the distinction too much between whether these things are merely psychological or whether they are something else. And so I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about this, how close the creative writing process and impulse has, how close that is to the old folk tales of being pulled or tempted into this other realm of fairy. And what if anything the creative writing process feels like in relation to the falling into the world of fairy.
Yeah, such a great question. I honestly, for me, I don't know what it's like for other people, but it's not very different, because a lot of the things that maybe would be clearly in someone else's imagination, for me, are not. They seem in reality itself. So for me, it's almost as if the imagination is more of a collective unconscious, or a space where everything that has ever been imagined exists simultaneously, and that space can somehow manifest in what we think of as reality. So for me, the distinction isn't what it would be for, I think, most people. But certainly the creative writing process for most people, I think there are some sort of ties to fairyland. When I think of fairyland in general, it's called Tirnano. And I apologize if my whatever Michigan accent makes that sound terrible.
That's much better than I've ever done with it. I think so.
Tirnano, and it translates as the country of the young. And in fact, writers have a strong tie to fairy spaces, as you can imagine they might. So for instance, there's like one story of this man, he was a bard or poet named Olson, and he went to fairyland for about 300 years. And then when he returned home, all of the 300 years that he was there kind of hit him instantly, became very old. And before he died, he was able to relate his stories of this land of youth to someone who then wrote it down. So I think the relationship between writers and the fairyland is extremely strong. I think of like Hope Perilous, Blood in the Mist. I don't know if anyone's read that, but it's one of my favorite books about fairies. And you can very much see the way that fairyland in that particular place represents sort of what is most creative and best in the people there, even though it's like this sort of terrifying space. But yeah, so yes, I do think it, I mean, I guess it's like the question of the chicken or the egg, which one came first? Which is that goes back to the kind of what you're asking me is, does it matter what's real and what isn't, or what's a hallucination or what's a vision? And for me, I think the most useful way to think about it is that the mystery, the paradox is always best left alone. That it doesn't matter if it's a vision or if it's a hallucination, or it doesn't matter if fairyland shows itself to the writer, or if the writer invents fairyland and that becomes part of the tradition. I think what matters is that you're able to connect to something that makes you feel more alive, which I think ultimately is what it's about.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's a really good explanation of that mystical nature of something like creative writing that is really hard to articulate. Like it is that I've never put that on the learning objectives on the syllabus of of a creative writing class, but but it sure but it sure is a big part of that experience. And you brought up another point that seems relevant to this notion of the demonic and the fairy, and I think one that mattered to Lewis as well. But this sense that although the demon might be, I forget exactly how you said it, Brandy, like one dimensional, kind of like they're just wanting manipulation and sin and evil in their way. And then the angelic seems like the polar opposite of that, but also one dimensional. There's something about fairy or the fey creatures in the land of fairy that is not, I called it neutral, but I was wrong to do so there too. You're right, it's a mix of good and evil. And it's not this fairyland, if anybody's like not familiar with it and listening to this podcast trying to figure out, well, what is this fairyland? Well, I don't really know, and I've read about it and I still don't know. but you're right to say that it's treacherous. It's like not treacherous, perilous, I should say. Perilous, dangerous. So what is this, Brandy, what is this nature? What is this complex nature of fairies, and why are we not safe with them even though they're not evil?
Yeah. You know, I think I'm still trying to figure that out, and it's never going to happen because part of fairies is they, or the fae in general, it's like so beyond what we're capable of thinking or imagining. I think it's just too complex, um, but I think a really good piece of creative writing will get closer to what it is. So like, for instance, we mentioned George MacDonald. At one point, I think those pieces get really close to it. Like the power of like a good image or metaphor, I think gets close to the feeling of it. It's really more of like a feeling or like a mystical sense. And once the second you try to put your finger on what it is and give it a name, it escapes you. So it's like the fae are very tricky in that sense that the second you try to pinpoint it, it disappears. The only way to like understand it is to be completely comfortable with the mystery of it and just be in that moment. Because the second that you try to figure it out, it's gone. And I think that is kind of what it's like to write as well. I think I might have gotten a little bit far from the question. What reminded me?
No, I think no, I think you're in that realm, and yeah, and I've been trying to figure out how to articulate exactly why Fairyland is so is so tempting, almost like a heaven like land, but so dangerous. Like you are in great peril if you go over there, and you'll never come back the same if you come back at all. And I don't really know what my question is. Maybe what does that mean is the question. I'm not sure. But maybe that has something to do with that larger question of like, why do these kinds of things like fairies and demons, why to further complicate the issue before I throw it at you, Brandy, and then you, Amy, and make this question even tougher. Why do these things matter? Like why is it why do they show up in works that feel like they matter? Or why do we even need fairies and demons in literature? What do they do for a story? Couldn't we handle all of these things with a purely quotidian kind of realistic story, poem, novel? Yeah, but something about it is different when we bring in the fairy and when we bring in the demon and when we play with both. And so why are they dangerous and why do they matter?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a couple of ways or reasons. And I think the first is just that there are these very mysterious things that happen to us, which are impossible to explain. And if we can put it in a form like a fairy or a demon, I think it helps us to think about it. So it creates something physical we can imagine and that we can um, just help us to like categorize these experiences or to try to like work through them. But I think just like on a very basic level, like the most basic level, I think we just love to tell each other stories and we like to scare each other, and stories infuse our lives with meaning and give it the layers that it really deserves. Because when you think about, I mean, nothing is really ordinary. You know, the ordinary is extraordinary. It's just that we don't see it as that. Like you just have to, it gives you, like shows you the reality that is really there beneath what seems mundane. Like beneath everything that seems mundane, there are just infinite layers of complexity that we can't perceive. And I think that these things help us to like physically manifest the real complexity that is there. If we were able to see it, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. That's it. And so maybe I'll ball that up and throw that to you too, Amy, because that sounds a little bit like Barfield as well as Lewis, like seeing these infinite layers of complexity, beneath what seems like concrete reality. And C.S. Lewis was a guy who, I mean, he was brilliant enough. He could have just been a purely logical philosopher, or he could have just been a theologist. But instead, he needed to tell stories about fairy creatures in Narnia, about fairy Narnia is essentially a fairy land, and even incorporates that kind of many lost centuries all in one night kind of experience. So something mattered to him about fairies and about demons too. So maybe I can throw that question at you too. Why do these things matter in literature? Why do we need them? And why do brilliant writers like Barfield and Lewis, why are they so fascinated with this other reality beneath this one?
Yeah, you're definitely right. Lewis, uh, especially prior to his conversion, he really was an Enlightenment thinker. He believed logic was the only path to truth. And in fact, he called it his chronological snobbery. Um, but yes, definitely after his conversion, uh, that's where you really see that. And you guys keep using the word complexity, and it did make his own conversion, I think, makes his his fiction more complex. And because of that, I think that's why he gravitated towards the 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 fantasy world, using demons, for example. I think we see throughout narratives this growing complexity, gravitating towards, we no longer see just black hats and white hats, for example. We see more anti-heroes, for example, and we find them interesting because they have these layers. And I think maybe it's something you were referring to today. This is where I'm going to have to apologize to my colleagues in the psychology department because I'm sure they hate it when I play armchair psychologist, or when any of us do that shouldn't, including myself. But you were saying earlier, and I thought that was interesting, about how you kind of alluded to how the supernatural reveals so much to us about our reality. And I think that fits in with the complexity too, because, we don't walk around with black hats and white hats. We're all wearing a gray hat, on some days when I'm on a bad day, I probably have like this gunmetal gray going on. On a good day, it's more like a cream if I'm having a really good day. But I'm more complex than putting on, just a black hat or a white hat. And I just find that so interesting, that how this the supernatural world, especially with demons and fairies, can give us a gateway into those layers.
Yeah, I like these a lot. And I'm realizing at this point that I've already kept you a solid hour or close to it, and so and I feel like we've just been scratching the surface on these on these issues. Maybe I was too ambitious to want to talk about demons and fairies and exorcism and the Inklings all in one episode with two people, and so maybe I did a bit much. But I feel like if nothing else, we kind of, although we scratched the surface, I think maybe we've scratched something that listeners are really gonna want to find out more about. So maybe we could kind of wind down a little bit with a question I love to hit guests with when I can. One that's like perhaps the simplest but the toughest. What monster is your favorite monster of all time? Or perhaps the alternate question is, what monster scared you as a child? So I'm curious if I could get your answers, Brandi and Amy, about favorite monster and or what monster has scared you as a child.
I can start, I suppose. You thought this was going to be a lighthearted question, but it's not going to be. So,
It doesn't always have to be. So let's go.
Yeah. So my most feared monster would have to be the idea of the satyr, or like it's also called a faun or pan, and it's a creature, big creature with from the waist up is human and the waist down is goat. It has horns. And so when I was a child, behind my grandmother's house, there were all these woods, and my aunt had reported seeing a satyr at one point. So it terrified me. The woods at some point were clear cut and a Walmart was built there, but I was still scared. And I was still afraid that somehow this like pan figure would pop up. And so I ended up writing about them in my second book, which is like always the way I handle anything that I'm afraid of, is I'm like, okay, well, I'll just write about it. And that usually does the trick. But yeah, so pan.
Well, that's creeping me out. That image of an actual pan. It reminds me a lot of
I
that
know.
brilliant book by Arthur Machen, The Great God Pan, in which this young lady, accidentally encounters this pan-like creature out in the forest. But then, of course, horrible things happen to her, and it's just horrifying. Way back in, God, when was that book? Like, I don't know, late 1800s, something like that. And it's still
Mhm.
just as horrifying today. And to hear that you had an experience close to that makes me even more terrified that he might be out there still roaming the woods where Walmarts have not yet
Walmart.
been built. Maybe he's in Walmart now. I don't
He's
know.
in the Walmart.
And Amy, how about you? A favorite monster, or a monster that scared you as a child?
I have such a different answer. First of all, I was so uncool. I just wasn't one of those kids that gravitated towards like horror films or anything like that. And I'm sure it's because they all scared me. So my answer is just supremely uncool, but I'm sticking with it. It was when I was young. I remember watching and loving watching it multiple times. Pete's Dragon, and the dragon's name is Elliot, and it's kind of that. For those who haven't seen it, it's kind of similar at the end to um, Mary Poppins. You know, Mary Poppins moves on. Got other kids to help. You're fine now. Well, Elliot does the same thing at the end of Pete's Dragon, and there's this child that he helps through a really difficult time, and then moves on. And I still, to this day, I guess why I'm sticking with that hokey answers. I still love that message. Yeah, I have long-standing relationships for over decades, but also I still really appreciate those relationships that were just for a season of my life, and I look back at them and realize, okay, they were temporary, but still really important. And so I love that message from Pete's Dragon. So Elliot is my favorite monster. In fact, like many people, I recently got Disney Plus to watch Hamilton, and so I watched Pete's Dragon again not that long ago, and yeah, absolutely gutted at the end again.
Yeah, and that's one of those traveling angel kind of story structures in which, the a mundane person has all these personal issues, or something's wrong in their life and they can't quite figure it out. And then out of some other land, out of some fairyland comes some strange creature to like throw everything into chaos and get them seeing the world in upside down ways that helps them out. Yeah, and then the Pete's Dragon, Mary Poppins, all those several Bill Murray movies. I mean, I think one script doctor said that the the two types of movies that are guaranteed to make profit in the theater are horror films because they're so cheap, and traveling angel films because everybody loves them and can't help but love them. I think that's interesting. So maybe that does have a little bit of connection to fairy, and definitely seeing Pan in the woods or in Walmart is a very much a disturbing, either demon-like or fairy-like experience as well. This has been a really fun conversation. It's cool. I think we went some deep places, some interesting places. I'm curious if you could tell us where listeners could find out more about you, about your projects, about what you're into. And it's easy. I think it's perhaps easier to do if you're a fiction writer. You definitely clear those pathways. If you're a scholar, perhaps you're not constantly opening up, Amazon pages for people to get at your works or what you're into. But still, if people have questions about the kinds of things that you've talked about or about your work, because we get all sorts of range of writers and students and scholars listening to the show. Where might they find out more about you? Where might they find your work, or where could they like reach out to you if they have further questions and comments? Maybe we'll go Brandi first, and then Amy second, if that's okay.
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, thanks so much for asking. And I do have a poorly designed website, brandigeorgepoetry.com.
It's
I
not poorly
also
designed, by the way. I've seen it.
thank you. Thank you. And I have a couple of books out. My first book, Gog, is about the exorcism, and that's from Black Lawrence Press. It's poetry. And the second book, Fawn, is about the satyr, kind of, and that is a play in verse, and that's available from Plays in Verse. And then the the Fairy Project is not; it is still in the works.
Awesome, thank you. Amy, how about you?
It goes back to, well, first of all, I'm going to back just a second. I too want to thank you. This has been just so much fun. I have learned so much by what you had to say, and I even got to learn some things about my colleague. So I really enjoyed that. I'm also from Michigan, by the way, Brandi. We'll have to chat about that. But what I'm doing does go back to what I mentioned earlier, the research I did on, which turned into kind of the dynamics between the Barfields themselves and their relationship with C.S. Lewis. I also make connections to Lewis's nonfiction work, The Four Loves, through that. I've had the opportunity, I presented at research events right here at FSW. I also presented at a Christianity and Literature conference, a regional conference that they do last year. I have been invited to present at the Lewis and Friends Colloquium at Taylor University. And that would have happened in June, but I am invited to, when they reschedule, I've been invited to speak there. As far as written, I just submitted, not too long ago, I submitted an article about my research. So I'm hopeful at this point.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, and thank you for the kind words too. And I think it's cool how you get to find out a little bit more about each other, and even finding out about Michigan roots and monsters bringing people together once again. um, Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, we touched on so many cool things, and I think perhaps we've created more questions than we have answered for a lot of listeners. But they're all questions about very cool things, and so I think we've perhaps opened, if we haven't opened doors to fairylands and portals to hell quite yet in this episode, maybe we cracked the windows on both, and so people could peek in a little bit and find out quite a bit more, because I think we got some really cool ideas on record here. So once again, I'd like to thank you so much, Amy and Brandi, for joining me on The Monster Professor. It's been a blast.
Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate it.